The creation of the Warsaw Pact in 1955 was not just a reaction to NATO's expansion, it was the result of years of Soviet security anxieties, ideological confrontation, and a hardening division of Europe. The treaty, formerly known as the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance, bound the USSR and its Eastern European satellites into a military bloc that mirrored and countered the Western alliance. This video examines the series of perceived threats, diplomatic failures, and the powerful logic of Cold War confrontation. Even before NATO's founding in 1949, Soviet leadership under Joseph Stalin viewed the West with deep suspicion. The Marshall Plan, 1947, America's massive economic aid program for war-torn Europe, was seen in Moscow as an attempt to lure Eastern Bloc nations away from Soviet influence. Stalin responded by tightening control, purging non-communist parties, and establishing Cominform, a centralized organization to coordinate communist movements across Europe. The Berlin Blockade, 1948–1949, was a critical turning point. When the Western powers introduced a new currency in their occupied zones and moved toward forming West Germany, the Soviets cut off all land access to West Berlin. The Western airlift not only broke the blockade but demonstrated NATO's emerging cohesion. For the Kremlin, it confirmed that the US and its allies were willing to resist Soviet pressure militarily if necessary. The Korean War, 1950–1953, had profound ripple effects in Europe. Just as Western leaders saw Stalin's hand behind North Korea's invasion, Soviet strategists interpreted NATO's rapid militarization as preparation for an offensive. The establishment of SHAPE in 1950, the permanent stationing of US troops in Europe, and the push for West German rearmament all reinforced Soviet fears of encirclement. To Soviet eyes, the idea of a European Defense Community, EDC, though ultimately it did not take off, was particularly alarming. The idea of a rearmed West Germany integrated into a Western military structure was unacceptable to Moscow. When the EDC collapsed in 1954, NATO moved rapidly to incorporate West Germany directly. It was a decision that confirmed Moscow's fears, and triggered the final Soviet counter-move. On May 5, 1955, the Paris Agreements came into force, ending the Allied occupation of West Germany and granting it full sovereignty with the condition that it join NATO. For the USSR, this was a red line crossed. Just 9 days later, the Soviet Union gathered its Eastern European allies Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. East Germany would join in 1956, to sign the Warsaw Pact on May 14, 1955. The treaty was framed as a defensive agreement, but it served three important purposes. Firstly, it aimed to legitimize Soviet military dominance. The pact gave legal cover to the continued stationing of Soviet troops across Eastern Europe, ensuring military control over these states to rival US forces in Europe. Secondly, by formalizing a unified command structure, modeled after NATO's, the USSR could present itself as leading a coalition, not satellite states. Thirdly, it was to prevent Eastern Bloc defections to the Western Bloc. After Yugoslavia's 1948 split from the Soviet Union, the Kremlin needed mechanisms to enforce loyalty. The Warsaw Pact became both a military alliance and a political leash. The Supreme Commander was always a Soviet general, and Moscow retained veto power over all major decisions. The pact's first major test came in 1956, when Hungary attempted to leave both the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet orbit. The response was swift. Soviet tanks crushed the uprising. The Warsaw Pact also served as a tool for military standardization, with Soviet equipment, doctrines, and training imposed across Eastern Europe. Joint exercises, like SHIELD maneuvers, drilled Warsaw Pact forces in large-scale offensive operations, suggesting that, despite its defensive rhetoric, the alliance was prepared for a potential war in Europe. The Warsaw Pact's creation completed the bipolar division of Europe. While the Warsaw Pact was designed to maintain Soviet hegemony, it also reflected genuine Soviet fears, the memory of Nazi invasion in 1941, the ideological hostility of the West, and the specter of a rearmed Germany. For the next 36 years, the Warsaw Pact would serve as the Eastern Bloc's military backbone, until revolutions in 1989 tore it apart. But in 1955, it stood as both a shield and a shackle to rival NATO, a symbol of Soviet power, and of the Cold War's irreversible hardening. The construction of the Berlin Wall in August 1961 was the most visible symbol of the Cold War's division not just of Germany, but of Europe itself. A physical barrier of concrete, barbed wire, and guard towers, it was built to stop East Germans moving to the west. But its impact went far beyond Berlin. It escalated tensions between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, turned the city into a potential nuclear battleground, and cemented the ideological battle lines of the Cold War for decades to come. Since the end of World War II, Berlin had been a city under four-power occupation: American, British, French, and Soviet. Between 1949 and 1961, nearly 3 million East Germans, 20% of the population, fled to the west, most through Berlin, where the border was still relatively open. For Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, this was unsustainable. The GDR's collapse would threaten the entire Warsaw Pact, so he demanded that the West recognize East Germany as a sovereign state and end Berlin's occupation. When President John F. Kennedy refused, Khrushchev gambled on a drastic solution: closing the border for good. In the early hours of August 13, 1961, East German troops and police installed barbed wire and barricades, sealing off West Berlin. Within days, construction began on a concrete wall, guarded by watchtowers. The Western powers were caught off guard. Though intelligence had warned of a crackdown, the speed of the operation stunned them. Kennedy's response was cautious but firm: "We cannot and will not permit the communists to drive us out of Berlin." The US reinforced its garrison in West Berlin but avoided direct military confrontation. Privately, some officials saw the wall as a grim but stabilizing solution better than war. The wall did not just split a city, it became the front line of the Cold War. Both alliances faced off in a series of high-stakes confrontations. One of these was the Checkpoint Charlie crisis, October 1961, when US diplomats were denied entry into East Berlin. American and Soviet tanks faced each other just meters apart for 16 tense hours. A wrong move could have sparked war, but both sides eventually backed down. After years of brinkmanship, the US, USSR, UK, and France finally reached a deal, the Berlin Quadripartite Agreement, 1971. The effect of this deal was to stabilize access to Berlin, but the wall remained. Propaganda battles raged around Berlin. In fact, West Berlin became a symbol of the Western model of capitalism, with speeches like Kennedy's "Ich bin ein Berliner," 1963, rallying morale. Meanwhile, the East called it an anti-fascist protection rampart, claiming that it shielded socialism from Western sabotage. Paradoxically, the war reduced immediate tensions by freezing the status quo. Over 28 years, at least 140 people were killed trying to cross it, with many more imprisoned. Yet it also forced both sides into a grudging acceptance of Europe's division, paving the way for détente in the 1970s.